Harry Maguire. Before he became a polarising figure at Old Trafford, Harry Maguire was the bedrock of England's defence and a player Manchester United trusted enough to make the world's most expensive defender with an £80 million transfer fee. Known for his aerial dominance and leadership, he had just finished a season as the club's captain. However, that reputation for reliability shattered in the early hours of August 21st, 2020, on the Greek island of Mykonos. What began as a family holiday spiralled into chaos outside a bar, according to police reports, when officers intervened to break up a brawl involving Maguire's entourage. The situation escalated violently. Police alleged that Maguire physically assaulted officers and, in a desperate panic, attempted to bribe them to release him, infamously asking, "Do you know who I am?" A court on the island of Syros quickly found him guilty of aggravated assault, resisting arrest, and repeated attempts of bribery. The judge handed down a sentence of 21 months in prison, suspended for 3 years. The prosecution detailed how Maguire kicked an officer in the leg and tried to buy his way out of trouble, claims Maguire vehemently denied in a tearful BBC interview. The consequences were immediate and severe. Gareth Southgate was forced to withdraw him from the England squad for the Nations League, and the Mykonos incident became a weapon for his critics. He was booed by fans across the country, and the psychological weight of the conviction coincided with a sharp decline in form that haunted his captaincy. Santi Mina. Santi Mina was establishing himself as one of La Liga's most reliable forwards, a key striker for Valencia, and later Celta Vigo, who was known for his clinical finishing and high work rate. He was a player on the cusp of his prime, but that trajectory changed forever in June 2017 during a holiday in Mojácar, Almeria. A woman accused Mina of entering a camper van where she was staying and sexually abusing her. She testified that Mina entered the vehicle naked and assaulted her, despite her explicit rejection. The case hung over his head for nearly 5 years, a dark cloud that followed him, even as he continued to perform on the pitch. In May 2022, the Almeria Provincial Court delivered a crushing verdict. While he was cleared of sexual aggression, he was found guilty of sexual abuse. The judge sentenced him to 4 years in prison and issued a restraining order preventing him from approaching the victim for 12 years. The court flatly rejected the defence's claim of consent, relying on forensic evidence and the victim's testimony. The impact on his top-flight career was terminal. Celta Vigo immediately exiled him from the squad, opening disciplinary proceedings. A planned escape route to Italian side Sampdoria collapsed after their fans revolted against signing a convicted sex offender. With Europe closed off to him, Mina was eventually forced to the Saudi Pro League to find employment while his appeals process continued. Jhon Viáfara. Jhon Viáfara was once a national hero in Colombia. The midfielder, who played for Southampton and Portsmouth in the Premier League, famously scored a wonder goal to help Once Caldas win the Copa Libertadores in 2004. But after his retirement, he fell into the trap that ensnares many former players who miss the wealth of their playing days. In 2017, under the code name Operation Gideon, authorities identified him not as a footballer, but as a key logistics coordinator for the Gulf Cartel, organising speedboats to smuggle cocaine into Central America. Arrested in Cali and extradited to the US, Viáfara faced a federal court in Texas in April 2021. He was sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in prison for drug trafficking conspiracy. At his sentencing, he expressed regret, claiming he became involved because he was broke despite his previous earnings. His professional legacy was obliterated. Once the man who brought glory to Colombian football, he is now inmate number 09616-509 in a US federal prison. His case serves as a tragic warning in South America about the dangerous allure of narco-trafficking for retired athletes. Jermaine Pennant. Jermaine Pennant was a prodigious talent, signed by Arsenal as a teenager for a massive fee. However, by 2005, while on loan at Birmingham City, his discipline had completely unravelled. In the early hours of January 23rd, he was arrested after crashing his Mercedes-Benz into a lamppost in Aylesbury. When police found him, he was still in the driver's seat, dragging the lamppost underneath the car. In a panic, he famously identified himself as his friend Ashley Cole. Tests showed he was over the legal alcohol limit, and crucially, he was already driving while disqualified from a previous offence. On March 1st, 2005, the Aylesbury Magistrates Court sentenced him to 3 months in prison for drink driving, driving while disqualified, and driving without insurance. The magistrate stated there was no reasonable excuse for his actions. Pennant served 30 days before being released on parole, but he was required to wear an electronic monitoring tag. The fallout was unique in Premier League history. Birmingham City manager Steve Bruce chose to stand by him, and Pennant became the first player to play in a top-flight match, while wearing an electronic tag hidden under his sock. His career continued with moves to Liverpool and Stoke, but the bad boy image stuck with him permanently. Ched Evans. Ched Evans was a promising striker for Sheffield United and a Welsh international, a powerful forward who had found his footing in the English leagues. But his career became the centre of a national firestorm in May 2011 at a Premier Inn near Rhyl. Evans was accused of raping a 19-year-old woman, a charge that turned into a high-profile debate about consent and intoxication. In April 2012, he was convicted of rape at Caernarfon Crown Court and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He served 2.5 years at HMP Weymouth, maintaining his innocence the entire time. However, the legal battle did not end with his release. In a rare turn of events, the Court of Appeal quashed his conviction in 2016 based on new evidence regarding the complainant's sexual history. A retrial was ordered, and a jury eventually found him not guilty. He had served prison time for a crime he was ultimately acquitted of. The professional fallout, however, was toxic and lengthy. Sheffield United released him after the initial conviction, and attempts to sign him upon his release collapsed due to massive sponsor boycotts and public backlash. It wasn't until his acquittal that he could truly resume his career, though the shadow of the case followed him to every stadium he visited. Troy Deeney. Before he became a Premier League captain and a vocal media personality, Troy Deeney was a rising talent at Watford with a troubled background and a short fuse. That fuse blew on February 29th, 2012, outside the Bliss nightclub in Birmingham. Deeney was involved in a violent brawl that spilled onto the streets, where CCTV captured him kicking a defenceless man in the head while the victim lay on the pavement. The attack left the man with a broken jaw and required 20 stitches, an act the judge later described as disgraceful. In June 2012, Deeney stood before Birmingham Crown Court and pleaded guilty to a fray. Despite pleas regarding his promising career, the judge sentenced him to 10 months in prison to send a message about public violence. He was sent to Winson Green Prison, where he faced a pivotal moment. His father died while he was incarcerated, forcing him to re-evaluate his life. Unlike many others on this list, Deeney's story became one of redemption. Watford stuck by him, suspending his wages but keeping his contract. He was released after 3 months, returned to the pitch with an ankle tag, and captained the club to the Premier League, often crediting his time in Cell Block C as the wake-up call that saved him from spiralling into total failure. Mickey Thomas. Mickey Thomas was a journeyman winger with a glittering past, having played for Manchester United and Chelsea. By 1993, he was in the twilight of his career at Wrexham, a respected veteran. But off the pitch, he was involved in a crime that was more only fools and horses than The Godfather. Thomas was arrested for his role in a counterfeit currency ring. Authorities discovered he had been acting as an intermediary, distributing fake £10 and £20 notes to young trainees at the club. The operation was unsophisticated, but the betrayal of trust within the locker room was severe. In July 1993, the legal hammer dropped at Warrington Crown Court. The judge condemned Thomas as a flash and daring adventurer who believed he was above the law, sentencing him to 18 months in prison. He served his time at Walton Prison, where his cellmate was a convicted double murderer who had beheaded his victims. A terrifying reality check for the footballer. The professional consequences were surprisingly mild compared to modern standards. Wrexham stood by him publicly, and remarkably, he returned to play for the club immediately upon his release. However, the stigma of being the money-laundering footballer became the defining punchline of his post-playing life. Gavin Grant. Gavin Grant was a striker who played for Millwall and Bradford City, living the dream of professional football on Saturdays. But unbeknownst to his teammates and fans, he was deeply entrenched in the tit-for-tat gang wars of London's Stonebridge Park estate. The dark reality of his double life dated back to 2004, when Leon Labistoid was gunned down in a revenge attack. Grant was initially cleared of a separate murder charge in 2007, allowing him to continue his football career. But the cold case of Labistoid eventually caught up with him. In July 2010, the legal system finally cornered him. A jury at the Old Bailey found him guilty of murder for the 2004 shooting. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 25 years. Prosecutors described him as a man who thought he had got away with murder, playing in the Football League while having blood on his hands from his role as a gangland enforcer. The professional fallout was absolute. Bradford City released him immediately, and unlike other players who hope for rehabilitation, Grant's career was terminated by a life sentence. He remains one of the only professional footballers in English history to be convicted of a gangland execution. Fabrizio Miccoli. Fabrizio Miccoli was the Romario of the Salento, the legendary captain of Palermo, and a former Italy international, beloved for his goals and passion. But his legacy in Sicily was destroyed by a shocking association with the Cosa Nostra. The investigation, which began in 2010, revealed that Miccoli had asked the son of a notorious Mafia boss to help recover a debt. In wiretapped conversations, Miccoli was heard calling the murdered anti-Mafia judge Giovanni Falcone filth, a comment that is considered the ultimate sin in Italian society. The legal saga dragged on for a decade, but in November 2021, Italy's Supreme Court upheld his conviction for extortion aggravated by Mafia methods. Miccoli turned himself in at Rovigo prison to serve a 3.5-year sentence. The court ruled that while he didn't use violence himself, soliciting help from the Mafia legitimised their power. The professional consequences were retroactive, but devastating. He was forced to step down from a coaching role immediately. While he remains Palermo's all-time top scorer, his name is now forever complicated by his insult to a national hero and his links to the criminal organisation that plagued the city he once led. Gary Madine. Gary Madine was a striker for Sheffield Wednesday, with a reputation for finding the net, earning him the nickname Goal Machine. However, he had an equally well-earned reputation for violence. In early 2012, his aggression spiralled out of control in 2 separate incidents. First, he broke a fellow fan's nose in a bar. 4 weeks later, he shattered a man's cheekbone with a single punch in a nightclub. At the time of the attacks, Madine was already known for his short fuse and had a previous conviction for knocking a man out in Carlisle. In October 2013, a jury at Leeds Crown Court found him guilty of assault, occasioning actual bodily harm and grievous bodily harm. The judge sentenced him to 18 months in prison, noting that when drunk, Madine displayed a callous disregard for others. He served 5 months before being released. Unlike many clubs that cut ties with convicted players, Sheffield Wednesday controversially chose not to fire him. He returned to the team upon his release, publicly apologising, and went on to have a successful career with Bolton and Cardiff City. However, the Goal Machine moniker was often rivaled by the tag Thug in the tabloids for years after his release. Jamie Lawrence. Jamie Lawrence is a rare story of a player who went to prison before becoming a Premier League star. In the early 90s, Lawrence was a teenager in South London involved in serious gang activity. His crimes weren't minor indiscretions. He was arrested for a bank robbery. In 1990, he was sentenced to 4 years in prison. He served his time at Camp Hill on the Isle of Wight, where he played for the prison team. It was inside those walls that he decided to turn his life around, using the discipline of sport to survive the sentence. Upon his release in 1993, his rise was meteoric. He was spotted playing non-league football and was quickly signed by Sunderland. Remarkably, just a few years after sitting in a prison cell, he was playing in the Premier League for Bradford City and earning international caps for Jamaica's Reggae Boys. His professional fallout was actually a professional beginning. Lawrence remains one of the few players to openly discuss how prison saved him from an early grave, transforming him from a bank robber into a Premier League cult hero. Ian Wright. Before he became an Arsenal legend and a beloved television pundit, Ian Wright was an aimless amateur footballer struggling to find his path. In 1982, years before he would lift the Premier League trophy, a 19-year-old Wright was living a chaotic life in South London. He had accumulated a mountain of unpaid driving fines and was driving without insurance. When he couldn't pay the mounting costs, the law caught up with him. He was arrested and sentenced to 14 days in Chelmsford Prison, a stark reality check for a young man who had been rejected by professional clubs multiple times. The experience inside was brief but transformative. Wright described the moment the cell door locked as the most frightening of his life. Surrounded by hardened criminals who mocked his tears, he vowed never to return. Upon his release, he channeled that fear into a relentless work ethic. The prison stint became the catalyst for his entire career. Within 3 years, he was signed by Crystal Palace, and he went on to become Arsenal's record goalscorer. Unlike others on this list, Wright's story is the ultimate example of prison serving its purpose as a sharp, corrective turning point rather than a career ender. Stig Tøfting. Stig Tøfting was the pitbull of the Danish midfield, a fearsome competitor who played for Bolton Wanderers and Hamburg. Known for his hard tackles and tattoos, he had a tragic backstory. He found his parents dead in a murder-suicide when he was 13. That darkness seemed to follow him. In June 2002, just hours after returning to Copenhagen, following Denmark's World Cup elimination, Tøfting went to a cafe for a farewell party with teammates. When the cafe owner complained about the noise, the situation exploded. Tøfting headbutted the owner and assaulted the head chef, leaving the owner with a facial cut that required stitches. In October 2002, a Copenhagen court sentenced him to 4 months in prison for assault. It was not his first conviction. He had a suspended sentence from a previous altercation in 1999. Bolton Wanderers eventually released him, and his international career ended in disgrace. He served his time at a minimum security facility where he worked as a gardener. While he returned to play in the Danish league and later became a pundit, the cafe ketchup incident cemented his reputation as a player who couldn't leave the violence on the pitch. Koke. Sergio Contreras, known as Koke, was a journeyman striker who had a respectable career, playing for Malaga in La Liga and Marseille in France, and even winning a league title in Greece with Aris. But after retiring, his ambition grew dangerous. In November 2019, a massive police operation called Vinculum targeted a drug trafficking organisation in southern Spain. Police arrested 20 people and seized a ton of hashish, weapons and cash. To the shock of the public, the identified ringleader was Koke. Prosecutors described him as the boss who gave the orders, managing a complex network that moved drugs across Europe. He spent a year and 8 months in prison on remand before being released on bail. In May 2023, facing a potential 16-year sentence, he confessed to leading the criminal organisation and accepted a plea deal of 6 years in prison. The striker, who once hunted for goals, had become a narco, hunting for illicit profits, ending his story as the head of a major criminal enterprise. Marcelo Pletsch was a tough-tackling Brazilian defender who spent 6 years in the German Bundesliga with Borussia Mönchengladbach and Kaiserslautern. He was known for his aggression and leadership on the pitch, a solid professional who made over 140 appearances in Germany's top flight. After retiring in 2011, he returned to his native Brazil to become a pig farmer. But in November 2015, military police in Paraná stopped a white Iveco truck registered to Pletsch. Inside, they found 854 bricks of marijuana, weighing a massive 793 kilograms. The sheer scale of the haul left no room for leniency. Pletsch was arrested and charged with drug trafficking. In 2016, a Brazilian court sentenced the former Bundesliga star to 9 years and 2 months in a state prison. The news shocked his former teammates in Germany, who remembered him as a joker in the locker room, not a drug lord. He served part of his sentence before transitioning to an open prison regime, but his legacy in football was completely overshadowed by his second career as a logistics man for the Brazilian drug trade. Delroy Facey. Delroy Facey was a familiar face in English football, a powerful striker who played in the Premier League for Bolton Wanderers, and had a long career with clubs like West Bromwich Albion and Hull City. However, after his playing days faded, he struggled to replace the income of a top-flight athlete. In 2013, an investigation by the National Crime Agency exposed him as the middleman in a match-fixing syndicate. Facey was caught urging non-league players to throw matches in exchange for cash, telling a contact that lower league teams were easy to corrupt. In April 2015, the Birmingham Crown Court found him guilty of conspiracy to bribe. The judge stated that Facey's actions struck at the very heart of football and sentenced him to 2.5 years in prison. He served his time but emerged as a disgraced figure. The conviction made him the highest profile player in the UK to be jailed for match fixing, transforming him from a respected journeyman into the face of corruption in the English game. Peter Swan. Peter Swan was a defensive giant for Sheffield Wednesday and an England international who had played at the 1962 World Cup. He was at the peak of his career in 1964 when the Sunday People newspaper broke the biggest scandal in English football history. Swan, along with teammates Tony Kay and David Lane, was accused of betting against his own team in a match against Ipswich Town back in 1962. They had bet on Ipswich to win, ensuring a profit when Wednesday lost 2-0. The legal and professional consequences were catastrophic. In 1965, at Nottingham Assizes, Swan was found guilty of conspiracy to defraud and sentenced to 4 months in prison. The judge stated they had polluted the game. Far worse than the jail time was the FA's punishment, a lifetime ban from football. Swan spent his prime years selling cars and running a pub. Labelled a cheat, remarkably, the ban was lifted in 1972, allowing him to return to Sheffield Wednesday at age 36, but he had lost the best 8 years of his career to a £100 bet. Michele Padovano. In the mid-1990s, Michele Padovano was living the ultimate football dream. A striker for Juventus, he played alongside Alessandro Del Piero and Zinedine Zidane, even coming off the bench to help the old lady win the 1996 Champions League final against Ajax. He was a cult hero in Turin, known for his work rate and crucial goals. But after retiring, Padovano traded the high stakes of the Champions League for the high stakes of organised crime. In 2006, Italian police launched an investigation into a massive drug trafficking ring, smuggling hashish from Spain to Italy. The investigation identified the former Juventus star as a key financier for the operation. In 2011, a court in Turin sentenced him to 8 years and 8 months in prison. Padovano spent 3 months in jail and considerably longer under house arrest while fighting a grueling 17-year legal battle. Although he was eventually acquitted on appeal in 2023 due to a lack of concrete evidence regarding his specific involvement, he spent over a decade as a convicted felon in the eyes of the public. The saga cost him his post-playing career, leaving a long shadow over his achievements with Italy's most successful club. Souleymane Diawara. Souleymane Diawara was a League One legend, a rugged defender who won titles with Bordeaux and Marseille, and was adored by fans for his warrior spirit. However, that warrior mentality led him to a serious error in judgment in 2015. After buying a Porsche Cayenne for €50,000 in cash, he discovered the car was stolen. When the seller refused to return the money, Diawara decided to bypass the police. He and his brother allegedly organised a commando raid to visit the seller's home, threatening him in an attempt to recover the cash. The French authorities did not take kindly to this vigilante justice. Diawara was arrested and charged with extortion and violence. Unlike many footballers who get bail, he was sent to the notorious La Baumette prison in Marseille, where he spent nearly 3 months in pre-trial detention. Although the legal case dragged on for years before concluding, those 11 weeks behind bars were a shocking reality check for a player who was used to the luxury of the starred velodrome, not a 9-square-metre cell. Uli Hoeness. Uli Hoeness was the patriarch of German football, a World Cup winner on the pitch, and the genius executive who turned Bayern Munich into a global financial superpower. He was a moral authority in the Bundesliga, often lecturing other clubs on fiscal responsibility. That reputation collapsed spectacularly in 2013. Investigative journalists and tax authorities uncovered that Hoeness had been hoarding millions of euros in a secret Swiss bank account, gambling huge sums on the stock market while failing to pay taxes on his capital gains. In March 2014, the Munich Regional Court found him guilty of 7 counts of serious tax evasion, totalling approximately €28.5 million. He was sentenced to 3.5 years in prison. In a dramatic move, Hoeness chose not to appeal, accepting his guilt and resigning from his presidency at Bayern. He served 21 months at Landsberg prison, where he worked in the clothing store. The professional fallout was unique. Rather than being ostracised, Bayern Munich waited for him. Upon his release in 2016, he was overwhelmingly re-elected as club president, proving that in Bavaria, his contribution to the club outweighed his criminal record. Omar Ortiz. Omar El Gato Ortiz was a recognisable goalkeeper in the Mexican Primera Division, earning a cap for the national team and starring for Monterrey. Known for his tattoos and aggressive style, he was banned for doping in 2010. However, stripped of his football income, Ortiz turned to a terrifying new line of work. In January 2012, he was arrested by Mexican security forces and paraded before cameras. He was accused of being part of a kidnapping ring associated with the Gulf cartel. The investigation revealed that Ortiz used his social status to identify rich victims, selecting targets for the gang to snatch. The victims, including the husband of pop star Gloria Trevi, were held for ransom. In 2019, the legal process finally concluded with a devastating sentence: 75 years in prison. The professional fallout was non-existent because his life as a free man was over. He is currently serving his sentence in a Mexican federal prison, a tragic example of a footballer who crossed the line from sporting celebrity to hardened cartel criminal.